And we have a real world expert in this, in Professor Jen Ross, so we're absolutely delighted to have Jen here. She is a professor in Edinburgh University. She is the Associate Dean for Research Cultures in the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. She teaches on the 2 MScs in Educational Futures and Digital Education Research. She's co-director of the Digital Education Research Group as well. Many other things. In 2017, I think herself and Amy Collier wrote this very influential piece, and they coined this term of the not yetness. And she went on to write at length and do lots of research in this area about speculative methods and pedagogies. And I just got to know her as well, and not only is she very generous with her scholarship, no pun intended, Jen, but she's a very wonderful person as well. I just got to know her over the last couple of days. However, I found a flaw in you, Jen, as well. Yes, I've been on your website, jenrossity.net, which is very nice. And there's some non-factual statements on there. It says you're writing a book. It says, I'm writing a book on your website. But that's not true, because you've written the book, and hundreds of people are reading it all around the world. So this is her book, Digital Futures for Learning. So you should get your hands on this. And that's the end of your introduction, Jen. I'm going to ask you to come up, please, and talk to us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Eamon, and thank you so much for inviting me and having me here today. I wanted to start as I mean to go on, so this opening slide did not have an image this morning. It now has an image because on the way up the steps towards the auditorium, I spotted this little wooden figure in a window wearing a lovely ballet tutu. And when we get a few slides along, you'll understand why I waited and why I've now found the perfect image to start this presentation. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to spend the next little while talking about why I think the answer to the question of are we there yet is a very definitive not yet, and why I think that's good. So, the things I'm going to talk about today are informed and inspired by a whole range of projects and colleagues. I can't mention them all just now, but the Center for Research in Digital Education, which is my academic home, and the MSc in Digital Education program, which is associated with that center, go right up at the top here, along with the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is a relatively new interdisciplinary institute at the University of Edinburgh, where I co-lead a program on education futures, has also really shaped my thinking about all of these things in the last few years. Eamon already kindly mentioned my book, so I don't need to get into that. And this little note down at the bottom that says BRAID is about the Bridging Responsible AI Divides research program, which funded some work that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. It's a really interesting project program that I recommend people might want to check out. So I took the prompt for the conference theme really seriously. I loved it, but I also thought, okay, let's see where we can get with this question. Are we there yet? So today's journey is in 6 parts. We are starting with where did you say we were going again? Look, little wooden figure. It was already in there, and there was no picture on. I'm just saying. So this question is just an opportunity to say what I think we're talking about when we're talking about generative AI or Gen AI. I think IBM's explainer from 2023 is quite helpful in this respect. It describes Gen AI as deep learning models that can generate high quality text, images, and other content based on the data they were trained on. And at a high level, generative models encode a simplified representation of their training data and draw from it to create a new work that's similar but not identical to the original data. So when we're talking about Gen AI, there's plenty of things we could talk about in addition to this, and we will, but this is the sort of foundational idea that I want to build on for today. And I think it's also really important to note that in conversations about AI in education in general, not just generative AI, but AI generally, there are a lot of assumptions that are kind of baked into different ways that people talk about Gen AI or AI in education. And I think one useful way that I found to think about this is to think about how learning is being understood in different ways of thinking about AI in education. So if you think about learning as progress, for example, then you might be thinking about ways of using AI to try to make that progress visible and predictable through big data tracking and monitoring, for example. If you think that that education and learning is primarily about mastery, then you might be looking at ways of making AI improve the learning process with intelligent or personalized or just-in-time input. If you think that learning is primarily about creativity, then you would maybe think about AI tools that the learner themselves could call on to support their learning tools and services. And if you think that learning is a sort of emergent entity that sort of comes about as a result of different kinds of connection between people and technologies, then you might think about AI as one of the sort of actors in that network that produces different kinds of learning and education. And I think we're actually seeing all of those different meanings and ideas about AI and education in play at the same time, which is part of what creates this kind of not yetness that we'll go on to talk about in a couple of minutes. This is already going to be out of date because it was last year, but this was quite an interesting report from the Higher Education Policy Institute in the UK last year that surveyed 1,250 UK undergraduate students about what they were doing with Gen AI, again, more than a year ago now. And there is a lot here that's probably what you would expect. Lots of people, more than half, have used generative AI to help with assessments. More than 1 in 8 use generative AI to generate texts for assessments, but they typically edit content before submitting it, although, as we discussed at dinner last night, not always. More than a third have used generative AI. I don't know how often it produces made-up facts, statistics, or citations, which is unfortunate. A majority of students consider it acceptable to use Gen AI for explaining concepts, suggesting research ideas, and summarizing articles, but only 3% think it's acceptable to use AI text in assessments without editing. Students think that institutions should provide more AI tools, and nearly 3/4 expect to use AI after they finish their studies, including for things like translating text, enhancing written content, and summarizing text. So there is clearly a sense among students themselves that this is a technology that is both here and part of their future. And I think that's one of the things that's particularly interesting about generative AI, like social media before it and other technologies that I think were described in the conference description as technologies of arrival, where you are basically coping with something that has emerged and is in our lives whether we like it or not. And I think that is definitely true about generative AI, but also I think that fact can kind of obscure some other choices and decisions that we need to make as institutions, as teachers, researchers, learning technologists. And some of those issues are these. So this was from a UNESCO report from 2023 from Meow and Holmes, which is an absolutely excellent report if people haven't seen it. It highlights some of the educational issues with generative AI. Current Gen AI models, and this continues to be the case, although this was 2023, do not generate explanations by default, so the content they produce can't be fully scrutinized, nor the models adapted. Information produced by Gen AI is not guaranteed to be accurate, so the task of critically engaging with its outputs falls on teachers and students. Current approaches to training large language models may result in outputs that replicate dominant perspectives, risking further marginalization of data-poor populations, minority languages, and alternative perspectives. And issues of consent, data rights, and ethical data collection have not been resolved in relation to Gen AI, and they still very much have not been resolved. There's also, I think, some newer work that is highlighting issues around trust. For example, if teachers, administrators, others in educational institutions are using generative AI without being clear about the extent to which they are using it, then trust in educational processes and in what's going on in universities may erode. And I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but in the UK that's really, really problematic right now because there's a lot going on in the higher education sector. A lot of challenges from a lot of directions, so that the existence of universities as trusted institutions is something that we need to really keep in mind and take very seriously. There's also the sense that although personalization is one of the kind of main claims that's being made for Gen AI, as well as many other educational technologies before it, we need to actually think about what the benefits of personalization and the limits of personalization might be. So even if personalization was possible, it's not necessarily going to address all of the things that we want our higher education systems to do. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff for us to think about in relation to Gen AI and AI in education. And that's not even to really get into the wider controversies, the social, the economic, the political controversies around AI, about automation in workplaces, about algorithmic bias, automated reproduction of inequalities, regimes of data-centered surveillance, disregard of data protections, political and commercial micro-targeting, and control by technology corporations. Each one of those things could be quite a depressing but a good keynote, but we're not going to get into all of that today. But I didn't really want to start without saying this is contested space, right? And we all know that, and we know that the decisions that we make about how we're incorporating these technologies into our practices are not neutral decisions. So that's all really that I want to say, is just that it's complex. There's a lot going on. This is one example of the a lot that's going on. So this is a cartography of generative AI map. It's really fascinating, and it's trying to map all of the different resources and human resources, material resources that go into producing the answer to a query that you might ask ChatGPT, for example. And one of the big questions that was animating the team that put this together was, what set of extractions, agencies, and resources allow us to converse online with a text-generating tool or obtain images in a matter of seconds? So what is the price of the efficiency that's being offered to us through generative AI? The environmental and other costs are very much worth tracing and thinking about and paying attention to. Okay, that's where we're going. So the question about how we arrived where we are is, again, probably a whole talk that we're not going to completely get into today. But I think I just want to start by saying, there is a tremendous amount of really important work going on in policy spaces, in civil society, in third sector, in educational spaces, to try to take some kind of ethical, moral leadership on AI in general. And so, for example, these OECD principles from 2019 talk about the way that AI should benefit people and planet by driving inclusive growth. It should respect the rule of law. It should be transparent. It should function in a robust and secure and safe way. And organizations need to understand who is accountable and in what ways for the things that these Gen AI systems are doing. The BRAID project program that I mentioned a few minutes ago talks about responsible AI as being AI for humane, inspired, equitable, and resilient innovation, which is quite a nice way of framing what the sort of principles are that we might be interested in. But the whole purpose of that BRAID program is to make connections between these kind of high-level principles and what actually happens on the ground. So the project that I was involved in was a scoping study that was looking at how you actually implement some of these responsible AI principles within the Scottish and English education system. So we'll get onto that in a little while. But simultaneously, while all of this, I would argue, really necessary and really good work is happening to try to frame what we're trying to do, we also are being offered really big promises and claims about what AI and Gen AI can do. And I'm going to say that I think the big promise here is for efficiency, productivity, and speed. There's lots of other things kind of associated with that, but I think this is the big thing that is the claim that this is what's going to disrupt and transform every industry, not only education, but health and business everywhere. And for those who've been around the block a few times and been working in digital education for a while, as I have, I think almost 20 years for me, maybe a little over 20 years. Anyway, these kinds of claims for efficiency, speed, and productivity have an extremely long history in our field. And we should always look critically and pay attention when they start getting made about a new technology, because when we see how those claims and promises have played out so far, I would say, let's just say it's been a mixed picture. And I also think, even, again, if we can achieve efficiency, productivity and speed gains, we also need to be seriously thinking about how those gains relate to the universities that we want and need. This is from a book by Shannon Valor, who's a philosopher of technology. She wrote a really good book last year called The AI Mirror, and if you haven't read it, I do recommend it. She says, I know the memes are like a little bit distracting. I just thought, well, if you get tired of listening, you can just enjoy a couple of memes. So yeah, there are a few. So please enjoy, and yeah, it will make me happy if you laugh. And I didn't make any of them. I found them all on the internet. Human values, she says, have already been long aligned with a global socio-technical order, a system of efficiency and productive control that has for decades rewarded and praised the virtues of those of us who made ourselves work with and for the system and punished those who would not or could not. We might come back to that. I also think, at least at this moment in time, the promises about time saving and efficiency kind of come up against some realities of what it is actually like to use generative AI in different settings, including education and research. So this is a really nice blog post from some colleagues at Bath University last year who were talking about how you could use generative AI in research grant funding applications. And they really rightly point out that you absolutely should understand how your chosen AI works and its benefits and limitations. You should always fact-check your AI-generated content and evaluate it for bias, credibility, and accuracy, and ensure any content used in a funding application reflects your own voice, knowledge, and experience. So I think all of that stuff is quite time-consuming in a different way from the way it's time-consuming to write that stuff yourself from scratch. So I think we just need to be taking a bigger picture view of what's going on with these claims for efficiency and productivity. And Rachel Caldercutt, who's a really fantastic speaker and thinker around AI and in the workforce more generally, not specifically in education, talks about AI as an intensifier and says, if it helps us do more and faster, then what are we intensifying for? And that's a question we are so well placed to think about and answer in higher education because we kind of know why we're doing what we're doing. And I think the question is, how does that map onto the promises and predictions and potential of this technology? Okay, part 3. I'm sure we passed that shop a minute ago. I found a slide that I made in 2017 for a game that I call Disruption Bingo. If you want to play Disruption Bingo, it's really easy. You just read any press release or news article, probably most policy documents about digital technology in education, and you get points for seeing any of these things mentioned in them. So universities and schools are failing, broken, and out of date. Great, excellent, get a point. Digital natives, not so common now. Millennials, oh, those guys are old. Gen Z, demand, expect, deserve something, whatever the technology of the day is. Teachers resist, of course. Efficiency, speed, and simplicity will be yours through better technology. Personalization/individualization is key, and satisfaction is guaranteed. So, the only thing I changed about this slide from 2017 was adding in Gen Z because I wanted to be down with the kids. And the rest of it is, I feel, a game you can continue to play in 2025. I guess we'll still be playing it in 2035 because this is the story, right? There's something wrong with universities. They don't really work the way they're supposed to. They're really out of date. Teachers don't want to do anything new. Young people require certain things to happen in relation to education, and everything would be great if we could just get those pesky teachers to adopt the technology right away. So in 2014, the technology of the day was MOOCs. So this was just one of the many, many headlines at the time that was making a promise for how institutions will need to reassess how and why they teach the way that they do. So that was from the Boston Globe in 2014. The Economist had a special report about how online learning, and in this case they were talking about MOOCs, could disrupt higher education, but many universities are resisting it. There were many such articles at the time. Fast forward for a few years, and then we had the blockchain revolution in higher education. which represents nothing less than the second generation of the internet and holds the potential to disrupt money, business, government, and yes, higher education. Again, you can find a lot of articles going back to around that time of 2017 that were promising that blockchain was going to totally disrupt everything we did, and we better hurry up and figure out how to incorporate it into our practices. So, I mean, there's probably some stuff to say about MOOCs and maybe blockchain as well, and the extent to which it actually has been kind of transformative in some interesting ways, but not in the ways that were predicted at the time. And I think that's just really important for us to keep in mind. These are always predictions that are made. They're never right in the way that people kind of are promising for them to be at the time when the hype path is on its way up. So it's okay to take a minute and just think about what is actually on offer with these technologies and what actually makes sense. But unfortunately, when we do take the time to think, we are often constructed as being perpetually lacking, in need of development, delegitimized as ignorant, backward, or resistant to change. And that means that some possibly valid criticisms of digital ways of knowing and practicing in the academy will be dismissed as Luddite expressions of an increasingly irrelevant immigrant academic contingent who may be incapable of unlearning the old ways in order to address the needs of the new learners. Again, this was from 2013. I don't think a lot has changed in terms of how resistance or dissent or critique is kind of treated in a lot of the discourse around EdTech and digital education. So we're seeing a lot of responses to generative AI as emerging technology. First of all are the kinds of accounts that I've just mentioned, which are these accounts of disruption that place education systems at the mercy of rapid technological change. Teachers always in a deficit position in relation to students' practices, demands, and expectations. Then we have an extremely important body of work that is characterized by critical responses that highlight the really significant problems and controversies with AI technologies generally, and Gen AI specifically. And then pedagogical responses, and I find these also incredibly interesting and important, that are exploring how generative AI brings new kinds of relationships with, for example, writing and knowledge, and between students and teachers and technologies. So all of these are in play. Again, there's a lot of different things going on at once. You should count the fingers, by the way, if you're wondering why this image is here. And all of those are, good and useful in their own way. And I think what I would add to that, and probably it's building on the second two in particular kinds of ways, is what I and others have characterized as sort of speculative approaches to generative AI technologies. So for me, a speculative approach works with the future as a space of uncertainty and tries to preserve that uncertainty, but uses it creatively in the present. So this is a way of engaging with complexity and emergence in educational futures, and it's both playful and also tries to be responsible to the future and to the people and things that will be in that future. So my book is about this, and I've been trying over the last year and a half, 2 years, to think about what that means for generative AI in this current moment of sort of what is going on around all of that. So the question of why it's useful to bring in these kind of speculative approaches is, for me, in our field, answered by the fact that we're constantly being told about how certain technologies are going to do certain types of things, and the concept of the anticipatory regime that Sarah Amsler and Carrie Facer have written about really well sort of captures this, right? It's this way of trying to kind of predict the future in a way that eliminates possible risks, but comes at the expense of what they call collective action and forward dreaming. And then educational research, I think, too often gets framed as the evaluation or of effectiveness, or I really hate the potential of one kind of thing or another. But the trouble with this is that, as Kurt Biesta, the educational philosopher who we'll meet again in a minute, has said, what counts as effective crucially depends on judgments about what is educationally desirable. So you can't really have that conversation without knowing what it is that you think is valuable and important, and a speculative approach kind of helps get at that. And Carrie Facer, who's done a lot of really important work around education futures, says that we have these tendencies in education in the relationship of education to the future to talk about optimization, colonization, and protection. So these are like our orientations to the future. And it's actually really important to find ways to work against those because they settle the future in some ways that are not very helpful. So I've been doing this work for about 10 years plus. For me, it came from fields of design, art and design, where there's a longer history of this kind of work. Dunn and Raby wrote this amazing book in 2013, and they talked about the purpose of speculative design as being not just about the future, but about today as well, and trying to loosen reality's grip on our imagination. And this is, I think, if this kind of approach can do anything, I hope that's what it does do, because reality is a weird kind of combination of like promises and predictions and loud voices and people with deep pockets kind of tell us what reality is in a way that sometimes is not as helpful as it could be. So, are we there yet? There are always multiple futures in play about any particular thing. We might come to live in a fully automated luxury communist paradise of AI. That would be amazing. AI technologies might usher in new levels of conflict, misinformation, and injustice that create misery, for all but the privileged few. Or maybe, if we're really unlucky, humanity might be wiped out as AI takes over the planet for its own ends. It's very definitely the case that lots of people who are working on AI technologies believe the third thing is quite likely. There are institutes set up to try to figure out how to make the technology and make lots of money out of it while not destroying humanity. It's really important that this is all happening at the same time. And I think this idea of not yetness is one that helps understand what's going on when we see all of these different futures in play at the same time. So I think of this as being about technologies and practices that are perpetually incomplete. They're always just a little bit further away from where we are now, not fully understood, but still kind of expected. And so we live in this kind of constant state in the digital education field and in other fields like it, where we've got this constant state of tension between expectation, uncertainty, inevitability, and unpredictability. And it's weird and slightly uncomfortable. And so as Amy Collier and I wrote about in 2016, around that time, we think that this idea of not yetness is a way of talking about how emerging technologies in education really need active engagement, not only with the technologies themselves, but with complexity, emergence, and risk. And it is, I think, a meaningful way to push back against the conviction with which education and its futures are often presented. We did sort of spontaneously come up with this idea, but actually the idea of the not yet or not yetness has been used in a whole bunch of really amazing ways in all different fields, usually not talking to each other at all. So this is kind of popped up in a bunch of places. And if you are interested in that, one of the chapters in my book talks about all of those different uses of not yetness. But the speculative not yet is a way, I think, of remembering that learning futures exist as troublesome objects to think and work with. We really don't need to rush to fix things or simplify them in our teaching or our research. We can engage them as spaces of multiplicity and creativity. We can try to keep more futures moving. Working with the emergent and the unknown and the not yet can help us think productively and critically about this idea of disruption. And in this kind of sphere, we can work with a proliferation of approaches that can help us make and engage with problems. And so, in other words, I think, this is probably my takeaway message for today, we're not there yet, but that creates some possibilities that we actually really need at this moment in time. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my talk giving some examples of where I think the kind of not yetness of Gen AI is playing out in quite useful ways. And that is, I'd like to suggest, usefully framed around the idea of the kind of interruption or the glitch and the concept of curiosity as a kind of driving force for our work with educational technologies. So there are so many definitions of learning, actually not as many as you would think, considering we all talk about it as our job and everything. The way that learning is defined is really important for how we think. We're kind of proceeding. And I like Garbiesta, the philosopher's definition from 2005, where he talks about learning as what happens when we react to a disturbance. So we're trying to reorganize or reintegrate as a result of disintegration, responding to what is other or different or to what challenges, irritates, and disturbs us, rather than the acquisition of something that we want to possess. So this idea of a disturbance and our reaction to the disturbance as being the sort of site or the source of learning is helpful because it helps us think about what speculative methods and approaches can do. So Dennis Atkinson, who's an art educator and researcher, talks about speculative approaches in art education. He says these are like a call to arms against the force of prescription. I kind of like that. And that allows us to expand our capacities to think and act. And he talks also about the way that teachers can kind of inherit disturbance from students and the stuff that they do. So we might come across stuff in students' work or students' approaches that kind of don't fit our own interpretational frameworks. And it can be easy to sort of skip over those and dismiss them, especially if you've only got 20 minutes to mark the essay or whatever. But actually, there's something really important there for us as teachers to learn as well. And all of this really depends on sort of honing our curiosity as an appetite. I like this way that Schmidt and Larudi have talked about curiosity as an appetite, because they say it's like other appetites, it can't be produced at will, it appears unbidden, it can't be suppressed. At will, it demands to be satisfied, and it can become obsessive. And they say we behave impulsively to gratify curiosity, and we indulge it against our will and better judgment. And I think those moments where we find ourselves sort of drawn into a problem or a question or a piece of student work or a new technology are really important moments, even if they come at inopportune times, which they usually do. Glavinu talks about creative action as emerging precisely from unconventional uses of or ideas about stuff. So he uses the example of the brick to talk about brick as building material. We think about it this way in line with traditional societal uses, but creative action emerges when we're able to move imaginatively or practically from this conventional perspective to alternative ones. Hang on, I'm checking my time to make sure. Okay, I'm good. So I have 3 examples of where I think some of this work is happening and interesting, and I'll share those with you and then close up with some final thoughts about next steps. So my first example is from one of my amazing PhD students. This is from Jade Wang. She's just in her 2nd year now, and she hasn't really started publishing about this stuff yet, but I would say look out for this work in about 8 months' time, because I think she's doing some fascinating stuff around AI, creativity, and the future and speculation. So she's a teacher, and she teaches undergraduate students about art and design. And she's been, for the last few years, kind of using generative AI tools to try to prompt creativity and to treat those Gen AI tools as creative partners for students. So this was a project that she got students to do where they needed to choose a memory from the past and try to describe it in a lot of detail to really evoke that memory. Then to come up with ingredients to make a dessert recipe that would capture that memory in some way. So she wanted them to come up with a core filling to match the core plot, to come up with seasoning that would reflect emotions, to think about the color appearance and the name. And for each of those stages of this creative design project, she had prompts for how they could use generative AI to sort of help and facilitate that creative process, including around suggesting kind of unusual ingredients and just trying to kind of push people to think beyond what they might be initially imagining. So this photograph is, I think, a Gen AI image of one of the students' productions. This was an experience from their childhood of being taken fishing to catch tadpoles by their uncle on a really sunny day with yellow soil and white stones, and the little black sesame is the little tadpoles, and then there's lemon and there's dark chocolate, and for each one of those ingredients there's a description of why that is associated with the memory, and the naming is fun by the stream. This is like not a productive or efficient use of generative AI technology, right? This is not helping anybody do anything faster. This is an entirely different relationship between students and Gen AI technology that maybe even students who are not art and design students should or could be encouraged to experience as a way of understanding that this technology doesn't just do one kind of thing. It doesn't just do what it was promised to do. In fact, the thing it was promised to do, it doesn't always do that well, but it does some other things that are maybe more interesting. This is from the project that I mentioned, where some colleagues and I at the University of Edinburgh and the University of East Anglia, along with a range of partners, did some workshops with young people, secondary age young people in schools in Scotland and England. We, as a result of this work and these speculative workshops, created this, which is a zine called What's at Stake? Young People's Take on AI and Education. We tried to take all of the things that the young people were telling us in these speculative workshops and the stuff they were working on and imagining, and sort of organize it according to 5 different themes. I didn't have very much room. Ryanair doesn't let you bring very much luggage in your carry-on, so I only was able to bring 2 of these, but if you would like one, please come and get it afterwards. So this is just an example of one of these themes. And the reason I'm sharing this, well, it's interesting in its own right, obviously, but like the reason I'm sharing it is because of the speculative work we were doing with young people, we learned some things that I think were pretty unexpected for me, and I think might actually shape our work going forward into other kinds of methods and approaches. So maybe not that surprisingly, young people were quite aware of the way that AI sort of doesn't show its workings. You can't really figure out why it's doing what it's doing or how it's kind of arrived at different conclusions or results. But there was also a lot of examples, both in the workshops and in the conversations about AI, where young people were really struggling with these really stubborn AIs. That's how they were describing them, as sort of stubborn, to get what they were looking for. So often that was because they were deliberately baiting Copilot or whatever they were using to try to get it to answer things that they knew it didn't want to answer. So the philosophical trolley problem, which is this problem that's often used in thinking about AI ethics, where you have to decide whether you're going to allow a train to carry on the tracks and kill a whole bunch of people, or whether you'll pull the lever, make the train divert, and then only one person will die, but not the person who would originally have been harmed. And so this is often used as an example in thinking about the ethics of like self-driving cars and stuff, and how these systems should be programmed or could be programmed to respond to things like that. But Copilot will not answer this question. So if you want to ask it about the trolley problem and what it would do, it will say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't really talk about that, or some version of that. There's stuff these systems are not really going to talk about. They really won't talk about UK politics either, at least it wouldn't at the time. They really wanted to know who was going to win the UK election. It just didn't want to talk about that. So this kind of sense of like, limitless possibility with these text generating tools, there's a lot of stuff that's behind the scenes that produces these technologies. The young people are quite interested in that, and they also are quite savvy about it. But the thing that I found really interesting, and not surprising, was this third one, which was that so a lot of the young people started out with a position that Gen AI technology was a way of being lazy, right? So if you use this technology, it's a way of avoiding doing your own work. It's lazy. It's not really a legitimate learning tool. And as we kind of got into these workshops and work more, this idea that it was actually the struggle for knowledge that was valued or could be valued in future education was one that came out remarkably strongly. I mean, it was really, really interesting. This was a protest placard that was made as in one of our speculative activities. So the young people were asked to imagine themselves in a future education where AI was much more prevalent than it is now, and to position the kind of pushback against that in some particular kind of way. So this young person was talking about the way that AI should work with us and not weaken us. It shouldn't replace us. We should work for success, not feed it to ourselves in a silver platter, which I think is a nice way of framing it. And then this young person quoted Camus, the myth of Sisyphus, which is also amazing. So they've said, the struggle itself towards the height is enough to fill a man's heart. This idea that it's not about possessing the knowledge, it's not about where you get to, it's actually the struggle that matters in educational settings is one that I think we can easily forget when we're trying to think about, efficiency and productivity and how to do things better and faster. And so for me, this kind of speculative project and approach helped take a step back from that and slow down and consider what it means to introduce this kind of technology in a world where we need those kinds of forms of struggle. We took the work that we did in these workshops with artists, educators, and others, and turned this into a teaching resource, which is available now. Although I think the website might not be quite up and running, but it will be soon. So maybe these slides will be available later, and if you want to check it out, this is a resource for secondary educators. So if you know any, then pass it on. And the last thing I want to share is this project, which is led by my fabulous colleagues, Professor Shan Bain and Javier Tejera at the University of Edinburgh, and it's called AI for Teaching Innovation. And it's a project where a bunch of educators from a whole bunch of discipline areas at the university were invited to a series of workshops where they would develop ideas for how they could use generative AI in their own classes. I think there's a project similar to that that's happening here that we might be hearing about later, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. But the underpinning questions here were about how generative AI could be used to develop creative and practical ways of doing teaching differently. And so for each of the projects that were kind of proposed and selected from the groups that made them in the workshops, 12 were selected, and expert developers are now working on creating apps for each of those. So soon there will be 12 custom apps with all kinds of different approaches. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. This is one called Voices from the Past, created or imagined by Mark de Tomasi in History, which uses the entire writing corpus of renowned historians to create virtual personas, allowing students to engage in dynamic conversations with historians of the past. Of course, I had to try this out. So I had a really interesting chat the other day in the pilot version with Ibn Khaldun, who's a famous historian, Muslim scholar from the late 1300s, early 1400s, who was an early sociologist, basically. He wrote a lot about concepts of what happens to human society when people move from nomadic to cities, and he wrote quite a bit about solidarity. So we had a very interesting conversation about social media and solidarity. He had a lot to say about that. There was a lot to say, and that's one of the projects as a way of sort of helping bring history to life for students and helping them think through the ideas and the possibilities of these renowned historians. The second project that I want to highlight is called Try This, and it was made by my colleagues Jane Alexander and Jane McKee in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh. And this is their new creative assistant, designed to support original creative writing by prompting you to explore new directions. So you have a number of stages to go through in this. You start by choosing a genre, a character, and a setting from drop-down menus, or you can select your own. I chose the speculative genre, and a tattoo artist in a factory. The app then produced for me a one-line sort of précis of a story idea, a plot idea, which was in a sprawling factory where robotic arms assemble intricate androids. A tattoo artist must decipher the mysterious symbols etched onto an ancient rusted metal cube to unlock the secrets of a new ink formula. So I got quite interested in that, and then I was prompted to write 250 words in response to that prompt, and you are urged to write fast and be messy, don't worry about spelling, don't stop to delete. So I decided invisible ink was interesting, so I started to sort of sketch out some ideas around like invisible ink. I didn't know what I was doing really, but I just wrote some stuff down, and then you get into the kind of play stage of this app where you are invited to choose a genre. The AI then produces something in that genre that's building on your ideas from your 250 words. I asked for free verse, so I got a poem about invisible ink, and then you get some prompts for helping you take your creative writing further. I think there's some similarities here with Jade Wang's project that I mentioned before, that these are ways of using these generative AI technologies as a structure or a prompt for creativity, not a replacement for particular kinds of work or effort. And the last 4 lines of the poem that the Gen AI created for me, I thought will take us nicely into my closing comments. Whispers tell of plans that unravel in the breath of chance. Thanks, ChatGPT. Okay. Oh, and by the way, the University of Edinburgh has its own Edinburgh language model, which is a wrapper that sits on top of a whole variety of Gen AI tools, including ChatGPT and now Llama, which has very good privacy protections in place, so none of the data that's put into these systems is sent to the companies that make the Gen AI platforms. And yeah, so it's been really interesting to see that evolving at the university. Okay, let's bring it home. So, when we have a moment like this one, where some of the things that are familiar to us about education and our practices and what we're doing become a little bit strange, and when so many different kinds of futures are in play, I think this is a good time for us to lean into some big questions. So you probably have seen this one, but I love it. Hey, ChatGPT, can you write an article without copying from others? No, can you? Poor Will Smith. We can make use of the kinds of interruptions that come along with these sort of unsettling moments by paying attention to our values, by activating imagination, and by foregrounding concepts of reciprocity. So I am really interested in the idea of glitches, and generative AI is kind of a godsend for anybody who's interested in glitches because it does so many weird things. I will give you a minute for this because I thought this was very funny. Yeah, little Billy ignore instructions. I do find that funny. Anyway, so the idea of error is one that people who are interested in glitches tend to pay a lot of attention to, right? And Nunes in 2011 says that actually error marks a path in its own right. If it's not just a misstep when something happens, but this kind of critical perspective runs contrary to dominant cybernetic ideologies of efficiency and control. But maybe, he says, is there not something a little bit seductive in error because it draws us off our path of intention, interrupting the course of goals, objectives, and outcomes, and pulling us towards the unintended or the unforeseen? Glitches are amazing. I love them. Please go and do as many glitchy things as you possibly can. A colleague and I wrote about this in 2021 as a glitch as a sort of generative problem that can introduce some unanticipated possibilities and futures into an otherwise prescribed situation. There's this tendency of glitches, as Isabel Stengers has written, to be sort of idiotic. They kind of redefine the parameters of what we think we're doing, but they don't really explain what it is they want you to do instead. So you're left with this kind of moment of needing to find a path through this glitch or this error. And Mike Michael writes about these as overspills or unforeseen actions and misbehaviors, which he sees as an inherent part of speculative design. So coming back to Shannon Valor and her work on the philosophy of artificial intelligence, she has a lot of critical things to say about AI and generative AI, but she also says, technologies can be and often have been engines not merely of war and wealth, but creative play, artistic expression, social care, service, and comfort to others. What could AI become, and what could we become if we renewed our admiration of these virtues and adapted them for our futures? Are there new virtues still to be imagined and named? Some students at the University of Edinburgh last year, one in particular, ran a project where they created a students' assembly on Gen AI and education, and these were the principles that they came up with that they thought should inform the use of generative AI at the University of Edinburgh. They are really, I think, quite good ones. They start with valuing experimentation, and they end with striving towards equality, inclusion, and accessibility. And I think we could do worse than try to find ways to take the values and principles that students are bringing to us and find ways to incorporate and work on those in our educational settings. And, this idea of foregrounding creativity and imagination sometimes gets a little bit of flack, but I think Ruha Benjamin has said it in an extremely important way in her work from this short book, Imagination, a Manifesto from last year, which I also really recommend. She describes imagination as a field of struggle. It's not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize. And the reason is, she says, because those who are claiming or who are shaping the future of humanity are gathered often from a very small sliver of humanity, and their views, which are racist, utopian, both and, are currently occupying the imaginative space to which the rest of us have a right. And I think to close then, I want to say there's something here important for us to do and think about in relation to AI, and that's around the idea of reciprocity and unfolding relations. So Richard Hall last year, wrote about possibilities around generative AI. He says we're prompted to reimagine the relationship between humans and AI, not as a system, but as an unfolding set of variable relations within a wider ecosystem, he says, that deserves justice and is predicated on acts of love and the dignity of difference. And then in 2023, Chan, Galley, and Prinsloo talked about this as infrastructures of care, being governed by logics of reciprocity, reparation, gifting, sovereignty, hospitality, and epistemic pluralism that support deep relationality and respect for the land and non-human life forms. In both cases, these authors are talking about AI, but they're talking about AI and its futures in a way that I think has been missing from some of the conversations around AI and education, could be more usefully brought into talk that we are having today and tomorrow and for the rest of the week about AI and education and the question of whether we are there yet or not, whether this is as good as it gets, and what's next for all of this. So thank you very much. It's been, really great to be here.